All right, all right, all right. I think we might be live. I don't know for sure if we actually are live. We'll hopefully get a confirmation here in just a second. I know there's going to be a delay. Oh, yeah, we're live. What's up, guys? My name is George Brooks. I'm one of the founders here at Crema. And all right, all right, all right. I think we might. And I probably shouldn't leave the live stream while I'm talking. That will create an awkward loop. We are revisiting a hot topic from 2019, one of our first devs on a couch, which is anybody sitting on a couch right now? I don't think.
Definitely not.
I think we're all standing.
Yeah, we're all standing. I wish I was standing. I wish I had my standing desk. We're all at home.
I'll stand.
It is 2020. And if you're not paying attention, we're all quarantined. So that's a thing. But we wanted to come back, and it's probably been, what, 6 months, 9 months? I don't remember when the original video came out. It's been a while since we talked about the great big debate on the mobile community around React versus Flutter. I wasn't in that original video, so I'm here just to help you guys keep the thing moving along and shut it off at a certain point because it's live, right? So just keep it to a minimum. I want to welcome all three of you. Why don't you guys do a real quick round introducing yourself? Andrew, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I'm Andrew Watson, one of the developers working kind of between mobile and the web, and that's me.
Cool. I'm Scotty Moon, a primarily mobile developer at Crema.
I'm CK Hicks. I'm a lead architect at Crema, mostly on the web side, but dabbling in our mobile stuff as well.
Awesome. Okay, guys. We're gonna jump right into it. And if you have questions, if you're watching us live, I know there's already a few people on there live, and we'll be trying really hard to pay attention to the comments coming through and answer those maybe as they pop up. But we're not like live experts, so give us some grace. We're figuring it out. But let's go ahead and actually, one thing I want to check real quick. We may be a little laggy, is what they're telling us. So we'll try to watch that. Hopefully, it's not too laggy as we move forward. If that's still a problem, we'll relaunch or something. Let's jump into it, guys. It's April 2020. What do you think about the great debate, Flutter versus React Native battle now? Open it up. What's our initial response as it stands today?
Flutter won. I mean, React Native is gone. It's completely gone. I think is how we feel. It's not there
I have
at
to
all.
open each of these videos with a hook like that.
That's right.
Kill, right?
Killed.
Yeah, I've actually decided to move all of my future work to Cordova.
Okay, so we want to start another fight, guys. Come on.
That's perfect.
So maybe let's start a different place. Yeah, they both exist now, right? There's no question that they're both going to have a presence in the world. I'm just gonna because we got a little bit of pressure. We'll use the word pressure from our internal team after we made the first video around our position on Flutter versus React. What are we currently primarily using here at Crema?
We're still primarily using React Native. Sorry. Maybe you should call on people. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just with the delay.
There is delays, yeah.
Yeah, we are still primarily using React Native. We do have some Flutter projects, like mostly lab projects or venture lab. But I love, it is April 2020, and this is still a debate. Like, it's still something we can talk about, and still like two very strong contenders in the mobile space.
Yeah, so and I'll add.
Yeah, go ahead, Scotty.
Sorry, George. I wanted to add. I think I would say the primary reason that we're still using React Native as our primary choice is mostly because of history, as well as the expertise of most of our developers. Because we're definitely a React shop, and I mean we can go into this later. But as far as like why you might choose React Native versus Flutter. I would say that that's probably one of the reasons that's kind of heaviest influenced our decision to keep React Native right now as our primary.
And I know that a lot of our clients are, I mean, we're in some ways, we suggest the best piece of technology, but a lot of times they're kind of bringing a certain request, right? And so they may be more familiar with React, and Flutter doesn't have as much exposure, maybe. But CK, you brought up earlier before we jumped on the call that it is growing. What are you seeing as far as the broader community, as far as the community that's using Flutter? What's that look like now?
Yeah, actually just today, Google revealed that they quote, nearly 500,000 developers are now using Flutter each month. Wow. So, I mean, it's definitely growing. We know React Native have a huge ecosystem, and it's very, very deep and rich, like Scotty was saying, with shops that are basically using that as their primary tool or tools. But I mean, the Flutter community is strong. There's a lot of really great support for it. There's really, really amazing support that Google has for it. So it's really cool to see it thriving and doing well.
So Andrew, you've been using Flutter on, well, when we were working on Jog, you've been using it on CupCup, which is one of our Innovation Lab projects, and a few other things. What have you learned maybe since the last time we created some video content on Flutter? What's your take on it now? What are you loving about it? What are some things that maybe still frustrate you about it? So start with the love first. Let's give it some positive.
Well, honestly, like, I mean, I came from React and then React Native and then went into Flutter, and it was kind of my first foray into anything strongly typed. So that took me a long time to kind of get used to. And then just the object-oriented angle, it took me a minute to get my head around everything. But honestly, I love how much comes out of the box still. I mean, there is just so many widgets that I feel like should be there. It's got native navigation, things even down to like a scaffold widget. They'll let you just kind of lay out your page, all stuff that it just makes sense that it would be there. There's certain things that I've just actually recently switched back to a React Native project, and getting back into that was like pulling teeth, because I was like, man, where is this? Why don't I have like these layout widgets or anything around navigation that I can just pull in? And I know there's a lot of talk around the reasons why that happened, but I think some things that I like about Flutter definitely is just how much is out of the box. Some things that I'm like, oh man, this is really nice within using like Expo or just React Native in general, if you're using that, or just like the hot code pushes, that kind of stuff. All of a sudden I'm like, well, that would be really, really nice. But obviously you can't do that in Flutter because it's
But I want to piggyback off that. We often start our projects, usually if we're going to do a React Native, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, for those out there that haven't picked up on it, I'm not a developer, I work with developers. But from my understanding, we'll start a lot of our projects in React Native with Expo, which does give us a lot of that hot push functionality. It gives us some out of the box functionality that we can kind of pull and beg, borrow, steal from. And Expos continue to work on that as well. But oftentimes there's a point in the development journey which we eject from Expo and leave it behind anyways. So you kind of lose some of those nice to haves that you get with Expo. Scotty or Andrew, maybe Scotty, you've done this a couple times, I know. On the React side, does that kind of say like, well, I mean, yeah, React with Expo, you get these cool things, but then long-term, you don't really get those cool things. Is that, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the strength of React Native is really a lot of the community projects like Expo, or, you know, Andrew even hit on this, even navigation, React navigation. Yeah. You know, I mean, but it's a double-edged sword as well. So it's good if you can play in that space. It definitely makes it easier. I feel like Expo, it makes prototyping apps like super trivial. Like I can crank out something and get it on a device like really, really fast because of that. But yeah, if you have to eject and you kind of lose all of that. You have to kind of look for third-party options or kind of roll your own for a lot of the features that Expo gives you. And I know that they're improving it. I know this last release, I haven't spent much time with it. I know one of our other developers has, but I know it's supposed to kind of still give you a lot of the features that you would normally only get in a Expo project prior to ejection. But I can't really talk about that right now until I've spent some time with it.
It's a secret. You can't talk about it.
And Andrew, what about you on the front of kind of, if you're getting started on a project? I know that it sounds to me like structurally out of the box, you get a lot of, and forgive me the vocabulary, components or widgets. What do they call them? Like the building blocks.
Widgets in Flutter, components in React.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's real
fair
fun.
Enough. You get a little bit more out of that out of the box with Flutter. Is that right? Is it easier? I guess that's the question. Is it easier to start a project with Flutter or with React?
Well, it depends on what your background is coming into it, honestly. I mean, if you're coming from React, it's going to feel very familiar. It's not a straight one-to-one, obviously, just because you've got JSX versus just JavaScript and HTML basically using React. But if you're coming from like Java or something like that, coming into Dart and Flutter, it's going to feel way more familiar, and you're going to be able to just hit the ground, I'd say, a little bit, running a little bit easier. For me, it took a little bit to get into it, but now if I were going to build an app on my own, which I mean, Cup we've been doing, I feel like I can get through layout and that kind of stuff a lot faster. Just because my dependency list is so much less. Like I don't have to worry about going and finding like these dependencies that maybe will work for me, maybe won't. Upgrading is like one line, or updating my whole app is one line versus trying to make sure that it's not going to break all of my dependencies that if you're coming into a project may or may not be legacy and have never been updated. So from a startup standpoint, I think for me, I find Flutter to be a lot faster now that I know both a little bit more in depthly. Just because so much is just right there for you.
Yeah, that was something we talked a lot about as we were prepping for this too, was like, if you're, an old soul native dev, and you're used to the OOP format, and you're coming from Java or something like that, like very class heavy and so forth, then that's probably going to be like Dart being strictly typed right out of the box, and having that the structure and everything you're probably more familiar with, like it's going to be easier probably to switch into something like that. Or if you're brand new, then you're getting all that stuff out of the box and you're not having to like juggle dependencies and third-party libraries and stuff like that. Whereas if you're like us and you're a React shop, then it makes a ton of sense to just keep using React Native because so much of it is familiar. So especially now that like the developer experience within React Native also has the benefit of having hooks, and they've redone like the React Native navigation. The third-party library has like had a big overhaul, and so there's some stuff like that that's been like quality of life upgrades that I know Scotty's done even more than me. But it's been cool to watch each one kind of like inch their way up in different fronts, and maybe even target different crowds for what they're really strong at.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned several third-party libraries and kind of leaning on those. So I've been working on a project that we've been upgrading, and it was, I think initially it was started in Expo like maybe 5 versions ago or something like that, ejected, and since then there's been a lot of deprecations. Apple and Google won't even allow the store to be republished because of it just needs to be brought up to standards. And that's actually been one of the huge pain points because of the dependency on so many third parties. Some of those are just not even working. Like the maintainer is no longer actually maintaining the package. Some, like React Navigation, has been completely revamped with breaking changes. So even just from a few versions ago, it's like we've had to rewrite all of navigation, which changes how you're passing state around. We did, because of hooks, I will agree, like hooks are pretty awesome. It's just kind of a more lightweight touch to get to your state and everything. But still, that so much has required so many rewrites. And I know we've only been doing Flutter for a year, but I've never upgraded Flutter and then have run into near the amount of pain that I have on a React Native project. So I think, maintenance is like a very real thing. Like when you're creating apps, like you need to think about maintaining that. And if there were like 3 or 4 libraries that this project was using that are no longer maintained by the third-party developer. And since there's no first-party library, what do? You go write it yourself, or you go find another library.
And that's something we've been talking about this obviously for a while, just this ongoing debate. And one of the big questions that I have is React Native. It's been started to be separated out into kind of these smaller, I don't know, sections for the open source community to maintain on their own. And I'm wondering, I don't know the answer. I know, Scotty, you were possibly going to do some research into this on what was kind of driving those decisions to kind of separate those out instead of bringing like React navigation in, which is actually recommended by React Native and those guys there. So like, what is the reason that everything's kind of separated out into these smaller categories? Any insight on that? Any further, I guess?
Yeah, I didn't spend too much time on that. But what you're referring to is the leaning of the React Native core. I think it was mainly just to make it easier to a little more wieldy for the developers to do upgrades and stuff.
Which was a big effort. Like, you know, that was a cool thing to see, was they really stripped that thing down and we're trying to like get it to, okay, what can we get out of the here so we can remove bloat, remove complexity. And I think it's still a lot going on, and it still does depend on a lot of other libraries to have what you would consider like a fully functional, you know, use case for a lot of developer needs. But it was really neat to see the React Native team, and we want to give them props for really going after it and to like get that core lean so that it's just a better starting point, and you can kind of add in the pieces you want as opposed to having like everything, which is kind of the benefit of Flutter because that's the strength of that framework, right? So I think a lot of times I think of these two frameworks, maybe this is incorrect, but I think of them like Apple and Android, where you have like iOS would be Flutter, where it kind of just works, but it's also magic and there's a lot going on under the hood. And then you have Android that's kind of like React Native that lets you customize things a lot more. But to get the full experience and to get all the pieces to work together, sometimes it requires a little bit of jigsaw. So I think it's just kind of, it's going to depend on what you need and what your strengths are, like we've been saying, but it is kind of fun to see each of these teams try and push into those different strong suits, I guess.
I'll make an old tech reference, but another way I've looked at it is like a Sinatra versus Rails. Like Rails, you get way back. Yeah, I know. Super old. That shows you how long ago it's been since I remember that. Yeah, a lot of web, but yeah, I mean, so you've got like with Rails model view controller, you've got your ORM and other things, even your middleware. All of that is kind of ready for you out of the box versus Sinatra, where it's still based on Ruby. But if you want to do a lot of the same stuff, then you have to pull in packages or write a bunch of things, you know. And yeah, that's kind of the way I look at both of them. So there's benefits to, you know, one choice over the other. One could be more lightweight, but you also get the headaches of that. So if you want to, you know, stick with React Native, then there are just some inherent things that you have to consider. Like I'm going to have a lot more pain maintaining it versus Flutter.
So what leads a company or a team? I think you talked a little bit about the difference between startups, but let's say a company is considering this, or a product team in-house is considering one of the two. What leads them towards one or the other long term? If they're trying to think about, I'm going to invest in something I'm going to keep around for a while. What do you think we see the influence of those decisions being right now?
I don't know who wants to take that. I'll start.
You go.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, if we are pitching to a company and they already have a bunch of React developers, I think React Native is a natural fit. There are also some technical considerations that you might choose React Native over. And that's if you wanted to do something that utilized hot code push. So since Flutter's compiled, I've looked, I haven't found any, I don't know that there's a way to do kind of the same thing But yeah, big. I think by its nature, I don't know that you could do that. But I could easily, if you're using Expo or any of the other code push, there's a few code push services you could use. But if there's like a bug fix, you know, you could just push it out, and then all the users would get that next time they relaunch the app, instead of going through the app store. So in one sense, it helps you fix bugs. It also allows you to be a little more lazy with your QA.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that. CK, Andrew, any more thoughts on that? Is like, we know why we might use one or the other, our personal preferences, but what do we see people, what's causing them to choose one over the other?
I think the reasons like technically are going down a lot more, just because I think there is a lot of similarities in performance and like the advantages, pros and cons between the two. Like, I mean, for me, I honestly would rather be working in Flutter, just transparently. I just enjoy that workflow a lot more. But our team is a React house, and like everybody can pretty effortlessly go between those two code bases and know kind of what's going on. And so I'm like not going to suggest starting any of our client work in Flutter, because it just we'd be so much slower for everybody to get caught up to speed, or people wouldn't be able to jump in where they need to. So I think the reasons people are going towards one or the other at this point is just where they're comfortable at this moment. Like where is going to be the least stress on their team to be able to get into a code base and be able to change code or onboard new people. I mean, Flutter is relatively new still. It is backed by Google, and this is something we haven't talked about really. I mean, that can be a blessing and a curse. Like Google is known for just slashing things without much regard. But then you've got React Native, which, I mean, they're branching out and giving it to the open source community, but that means it's going to be maintained by people as almost like a labor of love rather than having like financial motivation to keep things up to date. And so
totally.
Which one is going to be slashed, what actually has the longevity, I think is still, you know, we're waiting to see, but both are deeply ingrained into the App Store and Google Play. So
it's interesting too to see, you talked about people jumping in, even though we are very much a React shop, we have a React Native app that was part of our venture lab that one of our most recent videos is talking about, which is Vera. And it's got a large and exponentially growing user base. It's based in React Native, and it's one that a bunch of our team members, as they've had availability, have been able to jump in and help out and get up to speed very, very quickly, because like Scotty's jumped in, we've had several people who've jumped in and, you know, helped crush out some new features or work on something and then kind of go back to their other work because it's so similar to things that we've done. You could say that about anything. Like you get used to COBOL and you're suddenly in high demand, right? Like you can just jump
Isn't
in
the
and do your
government
code
looking for that right now?
right, yeah. But you know, it's kind of interesting because for us, that has made, like you were saying, Andrew, that's a huge part of our decision right now. But that doesn't mean that in a few years we get so many people familiar with Flutter that like that's our jump in and do it project or framework, you know. So it's just really interesting to see. It used to be like, oh, Flutter has 60 frames per second, and on their, you know, some of the really fancy list views, and like it's super performant, it has this and this, or React Native has this integration, or different things, and they're kind of evening out, and they're just kind of like getting more and more, I guess, just approachable from that stance.
Well, and even to like the one code base to go between almost everything, saying,
Yeah,
you know,
some of the comments in the thread right
now.
I
know, I saw that too, and it made me think about like the Flutter conference that happened at the end of last year, just talking about, you know, design to code and people starting to develop things for that, and how quickly that integration, like just taking your designs and translating them right into code, but not only just be able to have it on mobile, but then having the web version and a desktop version, all just from this one design that you're pumping out. I think Flutter is doing a lot with that, but then right after that, I saw React Native was pushing, there's a lot of stuff being built for that exact same thing. So it's just so hard because everything's changing so much, and it's really just people's preferences that is driving what's being created, but then also what's being used and what they're used to.
But in the comments, there's the argument that's being made, and it's interesting to see what people are chatting about here, because yeah, Flutter is trying to push this one code to rule them all. And in some ways, that's kind of what we were promised with React and React Native, React.js and React Native. Didn't exactly get it because they're really two different OSs, right? And we're dealing with two different ways that the tools work. Now, there's the whole long-term rumor of like, will those worlds start to merge? And they probably will in some ways, and they won't in others. But I think Wilson here made a really good point. JS does kind of rule them all right now. Like JavaScript is still ubiquitous; it's still everywhere. What are we most excited about as far as the long-term possibility of this unified world? Is it a unified world of JavaScript, which that's a whole nother argument, or is it a unified world of something like Flutter that gives us a one code base to rule them all? Do we want that?
I think we already have this. I don't know. I don't think this is controversial, but I think we're already there where you can do everything in JavaScript. I mean, you can write it on the server, client, just wherever you need it. So that's one of the benefits. Like if you learn JavaScript, you can already do that. The thing with Flutter or Dart in this instance, because that's the language.
Yeah.
I definitely have a wait and see approach. I mean, I've been following along with the web project, and it looks interesting. So yeah, I don't know. I think for me, I'm just kind of like I'm waiting to see what the Dart team, or the Flutter team pulls out, but it does look very interesting.
I think that is another thing that is interesting. We keep talking about JavaScript being, this kind of universal thing, but constantly what we see are people trying to change JavaScript to be more typed. Like, I mean, we use TypeScript, and we're not just using vanilla JavaScript. I mean, we're constantly trying to find in those libraries that are stable to just do the things that we want to do, so we don't have to write it. Where Flutter is built on Dart, which is statically typed, so we get that out of the box. It comes with all the native things. So to me, it feels like people are just trying to morph JavaScript into almost what Flutter and Dart have already accomplished in a lot of ways in my mind. Like when I went from Flutter back to React Native, and we're pulled in TypeScript, and you pull in all your type defs, and you pull in all the dependencies that you need for the whole thing, and working with some developers like, oh, it's so great, you just get all this out of the box. And I'm like, this is a mess. Like I just opened the project and the dependency list is like 30 long. Like it's terrible. And so I always wonder when people say, well, you've got JavaScript and it can do all these things, when in reality, we're always modding JavaScript to try and do what we want it to do. And then also React Native isn't really JavaScript still. You're writing in JSX, and it's not a perfect one-to-one where you wouldn't really ever take the full code base and just say, even in Flutter, and say, this is my mobile and my web code. I mean, it would be very similar, and you could use the same widgets, but they'd have to be, modified to do what you want to do. But you'd still be writing exactly the same language, which I think is the big advantage.
That is a really great point, because a lot of people have said, and I know I've even said this, that you just have to learn JavaScript and you're good for a React Native project. And that's actually not true. I mean, there's a whole lot of other things that you need to know. And I think you hit on a lot of that, Andrew, with the, just learning how to structure all your JSX, and then there's the JavaScript, and what if you want to use styled components or whatever, versus like being able to just write Dart with a lot of the widgets that are provided out of the box. So I think the learning curve on Flutter is that they give you so much out of the box. So you have to spend some time learning everything that has been provided for you. You got this new toy and you got to learn how it all works, versus all the different moving pieces that are constantly changing.
So one thing that I'm looking at as people are chatting in the comment thread here is, one, they're mentioning some companies that actually have gone from native to React Native to Flutter, and some pretty large companies. So I think people are starting to experiment with it. They've also, I think, Robson, Wilson, and Waga are kind of the three chatting in here, but they're talking a little bit about the fact that you do have this kind of subgroup of developers that are really excited about Flutter. And I'm trying to think back, and maybe you guys can remember better than I can. How long did it take for React Native to gain that kind of mass appeal when Facebook put it out? I know we were using it before it was open source, which was pretty dangerous, but we adopted it fairly quickly because we were doing so much in we were starting to move towards JavaScript, whether it was Angular or I'm trying to think what else we used back then. There was a bunch of different libraries that were kind of bidding for the top, and then React kind of on the web won, right? And then React Native showed up, and so we kind of started adopting that. I'm trying to think about the adoption cycle as far as like how long it takes for some of these platforms. Rails was around for a long time, and we were all using Rails with, you know, a pretty common CSS library on top. But how long are these adoption cycles? Has Flutter had enough time to grow? I mean, is it something we're going to see? It's 500,000 developers now. Do you think we'll see that scale up to be adopted more?
I think a big part of that, like not remembering specific timelines either, but a big part of that is what's your time to start and what do you have to do to maintain it? Like Scotty said earlier, time to start is a huge thing for developers, especially on small teams. So if you're on an enterprise team or you're building stuff for enterprise, then you're probably going to have not to standardize this, but like you're probably going to have more infrastructure in place for your continuous integration, or within the way you're building something out that is going to be more like, we're going to pick this framework and we're going to use it for a long time, right? And it's harder to switch when you're in those contexts. And so you're probably going to land on something that is like, has that more long-term appeal, whatever side you fall on.
Sure.
But when you're talking like, if you're an independent developer or you're on a small team, you might have more flexibility within your project cadence to actually switch between these tools. And I feel like that's what happened with React Native, because you had like early versions of Ionic were really not great, and now it's actually a really cool tool. Like Cordova used to be a really big thing, and then we realized
Scotty might not agree with you there, but that's fine.
Yeah, whatever. But you know, there's all these other tools that have kind of risen and fallen in their time because of time to start and what it takes to maintain them. And so even Ionic like underwent a big overhaul lately in one of their most recent versions. And so you have the Angular crowd that really loved it. Now it's become a lot more open and people are using it who are not from an Angular background. So there's just some really interesting things there I think anytime you look into the timeline, you have to consider what are devs excited about, and will that excitement bubble up to their management where they can, or are they in charge of their own destinies, you know, and what can they put into use? But then 6 months, 9 months, 12 months from then, if they're having to still maintain those things, do they want to use that again on a new project? And so even if it has a lot of momentum, like in GitHub, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue to take off in the market share, just because like those like vectors don't always line up. You know? Like,
So I was thinking back to the fact that when we started using it, I remember it took more than Facebook having built it, right? Because Facebook has a brand, so there's a bit of trust built in there. So people were starting to use it because they're like, well, it's Facebook and they're huge and we'll try it. But nobody was really adopting it yet because it was just like, I don't know, maybe Facebook will drop it. And then of course they went open source, but even that was like, I don't know, we'll see. But I think it was Airbnb, or maybe it was it was another big tech company that said, we're going all in on React Native, which I think they've actually since left React Native. I don't know what they're using now. But it took another company, another flagship company moving to it to kind of legitimize it as an acceptable platform to go after. And I'm curious to see, maybe it's one of these other companies that they're talking about in the channel right now, but what will be the other big company outside of Google that will adopt Flutter as their primary development platform for mobile? And that will be kind of the springboard to a broader adoption. I don't know that we've seen that yet, unless you guys can think of a company that, Scotty, you've been kind of following it pretty closely for a while. Can you think of a larger company that's adopted it as a sustainable long-term enterprise native mobile?
Oh yeah, I was trying to think. I know that we had looked at this. I'm trying to think of the company, but it was that calendar app or that journaling app. I know Google's done several developer stories.
That's pretty startup.
That's true. Yeah, I see. So
beautiful though. It was a beautiful design.
Yeah. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think what's interesting though, I mean, this is like very future looking, but with Google's Project Fuchsia. Dart and Flutter are the way to write apps for that right now. So whenever that comes out, I think that'll be interesting. No one knows what Google's really doing.
So I missed that. What is that? I may be behind on that.
It's this new operating system that Google is working on.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So no one really knows. I've seen it running on Chromebooks and like different IoT things, and so I don't know what it is. Is it the next Android, or no one knows? Who knows?
Yeah,
Google knows.
Sure. It's glasses, guys.
Yes, yeah. But but if you know Flutter and Dart, you can actually write apps for that today. So whenever it does come out, so that's very interesting. I think because of that, I don't really see it going away. That doesn't really answer your question though.
No, Reflectly. So Creative Bracket, thank you. That's it's actually a beautiful app. It's UX wise, it's kind of hard to use long term, but it was really well built, and they've got a little exposure for building it that way. One of the questions I want to open up real quick for you guys, and maybe you do or don't know, how you got into trying out Flutter, and was there a good source or a good course that you know of? That's one of the questions Smith is asking. Is there a great place to go and start learning Flutter if you're maybe ground zero?
Yeah, I was just looking it up. There's a course from the London App Brewery that I can't remember the instructor's name, but she actually worked with the Flutter team to develop this course. So I think that's kind of blessed by them. So I would probably start there.
Awesome.
I've actually done that course. It's good.
Oh, okay, good. And then Wilson mentioned Pluralsight has one as well, which I know there's a lot of great React Pluralsight content.
And there's tons on Udemy, and then, there's a lot of YouTube playlists that are just here's how to do this thing in Flutter, or I can't remember his name right now, but there's a guy who does like animation challenges in React Native almost daily. He's very prolific. So there's some really, YouTube is such a great place to start if you just want to get in and do more than a hello world, which we definitely recommend. Like anytime you're wanting to learn a framework, don't just copy the tutorial and do the hello world. Like make it do something slightly different so you actually are forced to learn it.
Yeah, give yourself a mission.
Yeah, exactly.
The docs are really great too. They are really well laid out and really, just very graphic in the way they present things. And I went there for a lot of my starting stuff when I was first getting into it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've done a whole lot with Udemy. I feel like I should own stock in Udemy. They've got all my money.
Funding yourself.
So as you guys are, I guess, thinking even for Crema, as we start thinking about the future, we're using Flutter on a couple different apps on our Lab Fridays. So if you guys don't know what our Lab Fridays are, then you probably haven't been watching our other videos on our channel, because we've got a couple of recent videos that were put out about innovation or our Venture Lab Fridays. And we do experiment a lot with new frameworks or new platforms and new languages in that time, because it's a little less risk for us, because quite transparently, our clients want us to use the most dependable, trusted languages possible. And so React Native is what our forte is in. But when you start thinking about other maybe Venture Lab projects, is there anything, I'm just curious, is there anything else? Is it really truly a competition right now between Flutter and React Native as the two solutions? Is anybody even coming up as the third? I guess native. Some people are still writing in Swift.
Oh, that was what was Swift UI? They just came out with stuff last year that was really cool. Their UI builder was, I didn't get a chance to play with it, but I really wanted to, just because it seemed so simple and it's all just native. So
but you only get iOS, right?
Exactly. That's a big drawback. I really think if we're thinking about the future, and like CK was talking about the ease of entry in that whole thing, I want to see what's happening with the design programs actually leading to usable code, because I think that's been one of the biggest things that biggest puzzles that hasn't been cracked yet, is taking these, great designs and having kind of an idea of what the CSS or whatever could look like, but not really being able to translate it right to code. But I think that gap is being filled very, very quickly. And so the first one that really has a well-supported way to do that, I think we're going to see a huge jump in the user base there of like
Yeah.
major companies. Because I mean, we go back to the major companies using even React Native, and Facebook doesn't even actually really use it. It's used on Marketplace and only in places. So it's not even used on their main app.
What are they using now? What is are they
It's just
going
native.
It's
Yeah.
just native,
Yeah.
and they just have dedicated native teams.
They have the money.
Well, that's true, and that's a big piece of this kind of story is that, yeah, if you have so maybe that's a recommendation. If you were running one of these larger companies and you had the resources and money, let's just say an unlimited checkbook, doesn't exist, but let's say it kind of does. Would you recommend completely dedicated teams to just writing it straight native, or would you still be using cross-platform solutions?
I'd still use cross-platform personally.
Is that because you're familiar with it, or because you think it's?
I think it's less work in the long run. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
but do you want to be dependent on other people then? Because ultimately if you're that large of a company, you're going to be dependent on another company. And I feel like mitigating
you're always
risk is
going
how
to be
these.
dependent on a third party though. I mean, unless you're Apple or Google. I mean, even them, they've got dependencies within. But yeah, I mean, you're dependent on Apple if you're just doing native iOS.
True.
You're waiting for them to upgrade things or fix bugs. Same with Google. So, I mean, yeah, this is another layer, but I don't know. It's not like your code's just going to magically stop working. It's really just like the forward momentum.
And maybe that's part of it as well, is that it's not about the language as much as it's about the constant improvement on whatever you're working on. And I think that's something we try to champion both with our clients, with ourselves, as the reality is like technology is never done. So anybody that thinks that they're just going to have a solution that rules them all and is finished and you release it and it doesn't need to be updated, it doesn't need to be maintained, it's just, isn't really aware of how
you don't need us anymore.
That's right. Crema would not exist if that was real. Right, exactly.
Good time, guys.
Yeah.
I will say, like, one of the things we were talking about when we're planning for this is I think there's been a desire for, us to say like one is better than the other. And the thing is, like, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything's a nail. And so I think it's important to, when you're going into a project, even though we're primarily a React shop and have up until now been mostly React Native, there's going to be times where Flutter is going to be a much better fit. And I love the fact that we have that ability to pivot, and to be able to work in that. However, if somebody needs something that's unique to React Native, or if they're a React shop and they want something that their developers can take and maintain after we're done, I mean, React Native all the way, no problem making that decision. So I think it's okay to like both. I'm with Andrew. I get more joy working in Flutter, just because of everything that Flutter brings to the table. I think we've talked on that a lot, but I don't despise React Native or anything.
Yeah.
Well, and we did just put out, so one of our apps from Venture Lab, though it's had a bit more resources poured into it, Vera was written in React Native. And that was because Luis, who's in the channel right now, he was familiar with that. He made the comment earlier that Facebook has said that there's 700 components in production written in React Native. On Instagram, most of Instagram is React Native, for example.
He's trying to call me out on that.
Yeah. So I think there's some truth in that. So I think it, like you said, you can enjoy something, but it may not be the right solution. And it's worth experimenting with. And I hope that's what our audience is trying right now, is that they're willing to experiment, right? They're willing to try it, at least get their hands dirty and get in there, learn it, and see what works for them. And if their team needs something, or they're going to continue to support it themselves long-term, Flutter's a great solution, because like they can own it, right?
Right.
I think you're right, Scott. If you got to hand it back off to a dev team that has, mostly JavaScript knowledge or JavaScript basic framework knowledge, then React might be the better solution. I feel like we're not being decisive enough. We're not naming a winner. I think people expected a champion to come out of this.
It's hard because like when you've been doing this for a while, you always end up like, it's really popular to read an opinion piece, and then at the end it's like, it's what works for you, you know.
Yeah, right.
And I do feel like we land on that with this discussion, even coming back a year later. But it is important to note that both of these frameworks have put in a lot of effort over the past year to make themselves, you know, still relevant. If Facebook hadn't done the or if the React Native team hadn't done the like lean core overhaul, then I think it'd be in a pretty rough spot right now. If Flutter hadn't been continually updating their like all the systems that make the magic work behind the scenes, then I feel like they would have been a flashy thing that maybe wouldn't have continued to be useful as you built, you know, infrastructure on top of it. It's really interesting. Like people are asking about like Ionic or Swift UI or things, you know, a lot of these are really, really good at certain things. But then they also sometimes can be like siloed. And so it's really interesting to like, yeah, the comment was just made like, if you want to really learn, I mean, you could just learn, you could be a Swift developer and have work forever, because there's going to be like, people are going to want just this like super like core down to the metal, you know, iOS app. And it's going to depend on what kind of work you're doing. But I do think that we can only say, the reason we can't pick a winner right now is because both teams have done a phenomenal amount of work over this past year. Whereas like we joke about Cordova and some of these other frameworks that have kind of gone out of style, like the teams realized either the tech wasn't useful anymore or the momentum was lost and they went on to other things. And I think if either of these two frameworks had done that for 12 months, then they'd be in a much, much different state as far as like the overall community sense of how they're doing. And a lot of it is, you know, developer perception, and that generates noise in social, and then that generates more like, so when a framework really botches something and really hits, like React Native hit a lot of stumbling blocks with their, you know, with the integration with all these different third parties and everything. And if they hadn't really stripped down their core and said, we're going to try and be proactive about this, then that would it'd be a lot harder for other teams to like have a lot of confidence in continuing to make things that are just for React Native.
That's a really good point.
I will say the nature of our business too. I mean, we do apps for clients as well as our own internal things, but we don't have, I don't know that we really have the, I want to say luxury, but I don't know if that's a really good term for that, but of being able to choose one or the other, because we still have to do both. I will say that for personal projects, I've been doing them in Flutter. So if that makes people happy. The first app that I've published.
Scotty said it. It's Flutter.
Yes.
Flutter wins. Yeah.
No, but I mean, just because I can choose whatever I want.
Yeah, right. Of course.
And I don't have, you know, I don't have to worry about all the variables. And so for me, I chose Flutter just because of everything that it brings you right out of the box. And I was able to build an app and launch it in like a week. I mean, it's super simple app, but still that's pretty cool. You could do that in React Native, whatever. But
I think Scotty, you're getting at more the core principles under how Crema thinks, which is that you have to value the perspectives of the team, right? You have to value the longevity of how this will be carried out beyond your personal desires of the moment. And I think that's where trust comes into play with the team working together. And there are very few projects that I know of. I do know a couple, but there are, you know, like one dev by themselves doing the entire thing all alone forever. It just doesn't really exist. It has to be something where you're thinking about the larger picture. But it does take someone like you, Scotty, saying, there's this thing called Flutter. It's from Google. I'm really excited. I want to try it. And then like introducing it into the environment and in us experimenting with it. And then asking the team, okay, is there opportunities to bring this in? And I think that's what I really love about at least the way that we're approaching it right now. Well, I want to wrap up. We've already been going at this almost an hour, which is amazing. I would love for, as people continue to watch this and to consider Flutter versus React Native, what are you choosing and why are you choosing it? Drop us a comment, let us know. We're super curious. We're trying to think about, again, is there something else that we don't even know about? I know there's been a few suggestions here for us to start doing some other battles, if you will, between maybe web frameworks as well. So Vue, I don't know that we do a lot in Vue. So I know they're talking about Vue versus Angular. And then, of course, one of the big ones that we're pushing a lot into right now is just, making TypeScript everything. That might be a conversation that comes out in the near future as well. If there's something that you want to see Crema put out on our development content, let us know. These guys love talking about how they do their jobs, and why not stick a camera in front of their faces and just let them tell the world. So we have some opportunities to maybe have what we have internally called dev chats, where we start brainstorming about what we're doing and kind of do some show and tells, and basically how can we make the team as a whole grow. And we'd love to share that with some of you. So I know that CK, you're working with the team on some possibilities of how to bring that to our channel as well. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, guys have any final thoughts on the big debate 2020 Flutter versus React Native?
React Native
results.
These are not mine, by the way. Those belong to my wife.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
not married.
That's a great way to end it. All right. Well, on that note, Scotty's row of products in the background are not his, but I was going to try to make something witty there.
Heard it here first.
You heard it here the first.
Sorry.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our channel. And I hope we should have asked earlier for them to like it. You're supposed to do that earlier. I'm learning to do that earlier in the video. Like the video. Hopefully you guys, we got 28 likes while we were doing this. That's more than we get sometimes ever. We're really excited to put out some more content for our developer community, because we know that's a lot of what our audience is on YouTube. So stay tuned for more for that. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.
See y'all.